12 years. That's how long I'd given to Wexler dynamics. I wasn't asking to be knighted. I wasn't even asking for a title change. Just a modest raise. 9%. A number I'd agonized over for weeks, rehearsed in my head, recalculated a dozen times to make sure it wasn't too much, too presumptuous. I'd even timed the request carefully, right after I'd landed the Oak Ridge contract, which alone brought in nearly $5 million for the quarter. I walked into Dean's office with a calm, professional tone, sat across from his oversized mahogany desk, and made my case. The moment I finished speaking, there was a pause, maybe 2 seconds of silence, before he burst into laughter. Not polite chuckling. No, real laughter, guttural and sharp, like I'd just told him the best joke he'd heard all year. 9%? He repeated between chuckles. Maybe it's time for early retirement, Jason. Then he looked back down at his computer, like I wasn't even in the room anymore. I didn't say a word. I stood up, straightened my shirt, and walked out his office. Not storming out, not slamming the door. Just done. I passed Claire in the hallway, his executive assistant, and, for the last decade, my only real ally in that building. She caught my eye, saw something in my face, and didn't say a word. She knew. Everyone knew. By the time I got to the parking garage, my hand was already in my pocket, pulling out my phone. The number had been sitting there under a Pexin for 6 months. Not that I hadn't thought about calling before. I had, dozens of times. But loyalty is a hell of a thing, especially when you're married into the family, when your boss is your wife's father, when your daughter carries his last name as her middle. But that laugh, that condescending, dismissive laugh, something about it snapped whatever was left of my restraint. I hit dial. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Apexin Cortec, this is Vanessa. I didn't hesitate. Get me Carl Whitaker. Tell him Jason Whitmore is ready. There was a pause. Then one moment. I stood there in the middle of the concrete garage, surrounded by gray walls and the low hum of fluorescent lights, my heart pounding in my chest. Not from nerves, but clarity. The kind that comes when you realize you've been playing small for too long. Holding back. Being careful. For people who wouldn't blink if you disappeared. Carl picked up. Jason, he said, voice laced with interest, like he'd been expecting this call. What changed? Dean laughed in my face. I said, I'm done. Let's talk. I met Rachel at a product launch in San Jose. I was 27, riding a decent wave of attention after optimizing a logistics algorithm that shaved months off a rollout timeline for a mid-tier supply chain startup. I wasn't dressed for photos or press. Just jeans and a black button-up I hadn't ironed. But Rachel noticed me anyway. She was running PR for some fashion tech label doing smart fabric jackets or whatever trend had grabbed the valley that quarter. She moved like she already owned half the room and didn't need to prove it. We talked by the espresso bar. She had this clean, sharp laugh that didn't try to charm, just cut right through the noise. We went for drinks that night and started dating not long after. For a while it was simple. We met on weekends, shared playlists, cooked together, binge sci-fi shows. I thought I finally found someone who made the chaos of this industry feel like background noise. It wasn't until almost 2 years and that I learned her last name, really learned it. Wexler. I'd heard it 1,000 times but never connected it. Wexler Dynamics was practically wallpaper in our world, mentioned on panels, printed on white papers, included in benchmark comparisons for any mid to high-tier architecture discussion. Her dad was Dean Wexler, not just the CEO, the founder, the kind of man who made into Forbes lists and had private airport lounges renamed after him. Rachel had always kept that part vague. I didn't blame her. If I'd known who her father was from the start, maybe I would have treated things differently. Maybe I would have run. The first time I met Dean, it was all wine and walnut-paneled hospitality. He played the friendly Titan card perfectly. Asked me what I thought of multi-tenant security flaws in SaaS platforms, as if he actually cared. Nodded to my explanation, offered an absurd bottle of Cabernet, and even laughed at one of my lame jokes about recursive functions. But even then I felt it, that quiet tension under his smile, like he was evaluating me the way you'd examine a car you didn't trust. He didn't have to say it. It was in the way he leaned back and steepled his fingers, letting silences sit a bit too long. Rachel thought the dinner went well. I knew better. 6 months after our wedding, Dean invited me to a casual lunch. It was in a glass-walled boardroom at Wexler HQ. No food in sight, just a proposal folder and a verbal offer for a senior architect role. High 6-figure salary. Stock options. A team of 20. He made it sound like a gift. his way of saying welcome to the family. Rachel thought it was a good move. He trusts you, she said. But the moment I stepped into that role, the air changed. My decisions were second-guessed. My calendar was filled with meetings I didn't request. My team was constantly reshuffled. And Dean? He watched everything. Every comment in code review, every system overhaul suggestion, every word I said in leadership briefings. I was never just an employee. I was a guy who married his daughter and now owed him. It didn't matter how well I performed. I was never going to be seen as anything more than the guy he let in. That role, that title, that opportunity. It was never about growth. It was about control. For 12 years, I gave Wexler Dynamics everything I had. I don't mean clocking in and clocking out like some middle-tier engineer waiting for a stock to vest. I mean everything. I lived inside that system. I rebuilt their cloud infrastructure from the ground up after their aging stack buckled under load during Q3 deployments. I designed modular scalability protocols that shaved server costs by nearly 20% in the first year alone. When their back-end team couldn't handle the growing demands of their B2B clients, I stepped in, restructured workflows, and built out a system so stable it became the backbone of their entire enterprise suite. Then came the flagship platform, Sentinel. My design, my architecture, my roadmap. It closed $80 million in contracts within its first 18 months. I didn't just contribute. I carried the damn company into the next decade, while half the executives were still arguing over whose name should go on internal decks. My salary, though, it crawled from $125,000 to $170,000 over the course of more than a decade. No bonuses worth mentioning. No equity refreshes despite the promises. Market value for someone with my credentials, with my track record, with my portfolio, easily $300,000 and climbing. Recruiters didn't stop emailing me. LinkedIn was a war zone of offers, most of which I never applied to. I told myself it was about loyalty. I told myself it was about Rachel, about stability, about being part of the family. As they loved to say over dinner when the champagne was flowing and the staff was serving dry-aged lamb over risotto flown in from some island I couldn't pronounce. The Wexlers went to Monaco twice in one summer. They spent more on floral arrangements for their spring gala than I'd spent furnishing my entire house. At those events, Dean would clap a heavy hand on my shoulder and call me our very own prodigy. Like I was some lab-grown mascot, they were proud to wheel out in front of shareholders. And I'd smile, drink the overpriced wine, pretend I didn't notice that my contributions were being diluted into bullet points for Dean's keynote speeches. There were moments, quiet ones, when I'd sit in my home office late at night, finishing what junior engineers had fumbled, and I'd think about what it meant to build someone else's empire. I wasn't building mine. My name wasn't on the patents. I didn't get a voice in the executive meetings unless Dean was too busy to attend and needed someone to babysit the pitch. I was told I was family, but what that really meant was that my labor came with a discount and my silence came expected. And I delivered year after year, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Because family, as I learned in that house, in that company, in those boardrooms, didn't mean belonging. It meant debt. It meant ownership. It meant that everything I gave wasn't a contribution. It was collateral. I spent 3 weeks preparing for that review. Every evening after work, after Rachel and the kid were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table compiling numbers, KPIs, integration benchmarks, performance metrics, launch timelines, uptime percentages. I built a case so airtight it could have survived a court trial. I didn't want to walk into that room empty-handed. I didn't want emotions or sentiment. I wanted data. I wanted results. I'd spent 12 years stacking them up, and I was finally ready to say it out loud. I deserved more. Not a bonus. Not a one-time pat on the back. I wanted a raise. A real one. 9%. Not even catching me up to market rate. Just a step in the right direction. A gesture of respect. Of value. Of recognition. I practiced in front of the mirror. Rehearsed every possible counterpoint he might throw back. Even the ones soaked in condescension. I wanted to be ready for anything. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. in Dean's corner office overlooking the bay. His assistant had confirmed the time twice. I showed up at 9:55, wearing a jacket I hadn't pulled out in months, clutching the printed dossier I'd assembled with every bullet point I could offend in my sleep. I waited. 10 passed. Then 15. Then 20. Finally, at 10:21, Dean strolled in like he just stepped off a yacht, talking into his Bluetooth about a ridiculous procurement delay in Zurich, and waving a hand at me like I was background furniture. He sat, didn't apologize for being late, and scrolled through his tablet while I tried to recenter myself. I eased into the presentation, showed him the revenue tied directly to the platform revamp I'd led, reminded him of the client retention metrics that spiked after we rolled out my security overhaul, walked him through the hiring and mentorship strategy I'd implemented that cut onboarding times in half. He listened in that way only Dean knew how. Half nods, shallow eye contact, tapping his pen like a metronome of impatience. Then, when I finally reached the part about compensation, when I laid out the request, when I said the words 9% adjustment based on performance and market value, he actually laughed. A single, sharp laugh. Like a bark. 9%, he said, setting his tablet down like he'd finally found something worth his full attention. Jesus, Jason. That's not ambition. That's entitlement. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Something in me was twisting, tight, cold, slow. He leaned back in that ridiculous leather chair, the one that looked like it belonged in a villain's lair more than a corporate office, and said, "If you don't feel valued here, maybe you should explore other options." His voice was calm. Too calm. He wasn't offering advice. He was daring me, pushing just hard enough to see if I'd break or bend like I always had. And maybe once I would have. Maybe 5 years ago, even 2, I would have swallowed it and left with another promise to prove myself. But not this time. Not after what I'd given. Not after what I'd built. I looked at him, and all I saw was a man who thought power was the same as ownership. And I realized I wasn't asking anymore. I was done asking. That night, I sat in my car outside the office for over an hour, hands still shaking, knuckles tight around the steering wheel. Dean's voice echoed in my head. Entitlement. Explore other options. That smirk on his face like he owned the air in the room. I didn't drive home. I didn't go anywhere near home. Instead, I pulled up the last message I'd ignored 6 months ago. Maya Denton, Apex and Cortec. She had reached out after a talk I gave at DevWest. Said she'd been following my work for years. Said Apex and was watching. At the time, I'd told her I was committed. Told her I had too many roots. Too many obligations. That was before Dean laughed in my face. I hit call. She picked up on the second ring. Jason Whitmore. Was wondering when I'd hear from you. I'm ready, I said. That was it. No pitch. No negotiation. Just 3 words, and she knew exactly what I meant. By noon the next day, I was sitting across from Gina Brooks, Apexon's VP of Engineering. Their campus was clean, efficient, no marble sculptures, no wine cellars in the lobby, just glass, metal, and motion. Gina didn't waste time. She'd read my file, knew my metrics better than Dean ever had, and came prepared. She opened a folder, slid it toward me, and let the numbers speak. 320,000 base, 30% performance bonus, equity package that matured fast and heavy, a signing bonus of 150 grand. No games, no vague promises about proving myself or showing loyalty first. Just value, stated clearly, stamped, and backed by a team ready to move. Then she looked me in the eye and said, "We want you to do for us what you did for them, but this time you got to own it." I didn't hesitate. I didn't blink. I took the pen and signed. It wasn't just a new job. It wasn't even about the money, though I'd be lying if I said that part didn't matter. It was about walking away from a house I had built with borrowed bricks, from a man who confused control with leadership, from a system that called me family only when it was convenient. That signature was more than ink. It was a line drawn. I wasn't switching companies. I was switching sides. When I told Rachel I had accepted the offer from Apexon, she stared at me like I'd just confessed to setting her childhood home on fire. We were standing in the kitchen, late evening light bleeding through the blinds, casting long lines across the countertop between us. I had rehearsed the words, tried to find a version that would land softer, but in the end, the truth was too sharp to dull. I'm leaving Wexler. I've taken a position at Apexon, I said. Her mouth opened slightly, like she was going to laugh or interrupt, but nothing came out, just silence. Then her voice dropped low. "You're betraying us." Us. That one word stopped me cold. Not because it hurt, but because I finally saw the framing for what it was. There was no us. There never had been, not when it came to that company. Not when it came to Dean. It had always been them. And me. And for over a decade, they'd used that illusion of unity like a leash. Family dinners where I was praised publicly but pulled aside privately. Gifts with strings. Holidays spent pretending I wasn't exhausted from cleaning up their internal disasters. And Rachel, she never saw it. Or maybe she did, but she never once pushed back. Not when I stayed late every night. Not when my title stayed stagnant. while I mentored VPs. Not when her father shot down every one of my promotion proposals with the same fake smile and vague excuses. Not once did she ask if I was okay. I told her that. I said, "You want to talk betrayal? You watch me give that company everything. You watch me drown in responsibility that should have been shared. Watch your father take my work and hang it on his wall like a trophy. And you never once stood up for me. Not to him. Not to anyone." She tried to say it wasn't that simple. That family businesses are complicated. That Dean was difficult with everyone. But those were excuses, and I was done swallowing them. I packed a small duffel, just essentials. A few clothes, laptop, documents. I left everything else. The furniture we picked together, the photos on the walls, the watch she gave me for our 5th anniversary, engraved with "Always Us." I didn't need it. I didn't want it. Walking out that night felt like cutting a cord I hadn't realized was strangling me. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a speech. I just stepped outside into the quiet, carrying less than I came with, but somehow feeling heavier, because the truth sat hard in my chest. For 12 years, I'd built my life beside someone who never really saw me. Someone who loved a version of me that served their comfort, but never the version that needed support. The marriage had never been equal. And now I finally understood that loyalty, when weaponized, looks a lot like captivity. The next morning, I walked into the glass conference room that had once felt like the nerve center of everything I had built. I'd spent years in that room, whiteboarding system overhauls, negotiating vendor integrations, pitching solutions that secured deals big enough to make headlines. But this time, the energy was different. The chairs were already filled when I stepped in. Dean at the head, Rachel to his right, her mother Linda beside her, and Catherine from HR at the end of the table with a manila folder already open like she expected blood to be spilled. Dean didn't waste time. He barely looked at me before launching in. "You think you're clever? You think you can just run off to our biggest competitor after everything we've invested in you?" His voice was calm on the surface, but the fury underneath was thick, pulsing through every syllable. He slid a document across the table toward me, the company's standard non-compete agreement. "You signed this when you accepted your role. If you go to Apexon, we'll sue. We'll bury you in court fees alone." I didn't flinch. I'd anticipated every move, every trap he might try to spring. I opened the folder in front of me, pulled out my own copy of the agreement along with printouts to California Labor Code, and laid it gently on the table between us. Under California law, non-compete clauses are unenforceable unless tied substantial compensation, usually north of $200,000 in base salary. Mine was $170,000. You know that. You wrote the checks. Dean's nostrils flared. He hadn't expected me to come armed. He looked at Catherine like she might bail him out, but she only glanced down and gave the slightest nod. She knew I was right. She knew this was theater. I continued, steady and without a trace of apology. "I've already had the agreement reviewed by 2 employment attorneys. You can bluster all you want, Dean, but there's nothing you can do to stop this. I'm leaving, and I'm not breaking any laws by doing it." He stood, shoved his chair back with a screech against the tile. "If you walk out that door, you're walking out on Rachel too." I looked at her then, not expecting a plea, not hoping for support, just wondering if she'd flinch. She didn't. She sat with her arms folded, face pale but composed, and said nothing. Dean turned to her, jaw clenched. "Well," she looked at me and with a voice like dry ice said, "He's made his choice." And just like that, the room shifted. The last illusion crumbled. I didn't say another word. I didn't make a speech or deliver some righteous monologue. I stood, picked up my folder, and walked out of the room I had once considered the center of my career. I didn't look back, because there was nothing left to see. 9 months into Apexon, I had already done more than I ever could in 12 years at Wexler. I wasn't just executing plans. I was setting direction, building architecture with complete autonomy, and leading a team that actually listened when I spoke. The first major overhaul I designed cut our hosting costs by 35% without sacrificing performance, something Dean's company had never managed even with twice the budget and 3 times the bureaucracy. I rebuilt their systems not as a bandage, but as a future-proof engine, something lean and scalable that made CTOs sit up during demos and say, "This is different." Then came the contract. A legacy Wexler client, one they'd held on to for 15 years. RavTech, quietly massive, a backbone logistics player with deep ties in healthcare and government. I'd worked on their systems back when I was underpaid and overworked at Wexler. I knew the pain points they'd tolerated for years. I also knew what they wanted that Wexler never delivered: transparency, speed, vision. Apexon gave me the green light to go after them. No hand-wringing, no guilt about crossing lines. Just, can you get it done? I delivered the pitch myself. No VP standing in front of me. No filter. Just me, my team, and the product I helped shape from scratch. RavTech signed within 6 weeks. The day the contract closed, word got out fast. Wexler lost the account before they even saw it coming. Layoffs started within the quarter. Quiet at first, then louder. Teams I'd once led were gutted. Projects I'd architected were mothballed. The board turned on Dean hard. His grip on the company slipped. And for the first time in decades, Wexler Dynamics stopped being a market standard and started being a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Apexon surged ahead, riding a wave I helped build. I wasn't watching out of spite. I wasn't tracking their downfall for revenge. I didn't need to. I had moved so far past that chapter it barely felt connected anymore. But a year after I left, I bumped into Rachel in a grocery store parking lot. She looked thinner, worn in a way stress carves deep into the skin. We made awkward small talk for a minute before she said it. Dad had a stroke. Her voice was flat, as if she'd said it too many times already. I'd paused, not out of shock, but calculation. I knew the kind of pressure he had lived under, most of it self-inflicted. She added, he asked about you. I looked her in the eye and said calmly, tell him I'm doing fine. She didn't try to sell me anything, not this time. No defense, no excuses. Just a quiet, almost reluctant confession. We should have valued you more. I nodded but didn't respond. I didn't need her regret. I didn't need anyone's apology. I had everything I needed: respect, freedom, and a legacy built on my own name, not someone else's. All it took was one phone call, and finally betting on myself. On Emma's 18th birthday, I stood in my own living room, surrounded by balloons I'd paid for, catering trays I'd ordered, a cake custom-made with her name in gold icing, and friends and relatives I'd invited because I believed this day mattered. And when the noise finally died down and the last gift was opened, she looked straight at me with a calm I didn't recognize and said that the best present I could give her was to disappear from her life forever, not in anger or tears, but like she was reading a grocery list. And before I could even process the words, my wife Melissa nodded beside her, rested a hand on her shoulder, and said her real dad would take it from here, as if 13 years of school runs, scraped knees, late-night talks, tuition payments, and birthdays I never missed were nothing more than a temporary favor that had finally expired. I didn't raise my voice, didn't offend myself, didn't ask what I'd done wrong, because the humiliation hit too fast and too deep, a hot, suffocating pressure in my chest while people avoided my eyes and pretended to fuss with napkins and phones. And all I could think about was how I'd spent months planning that party, working overtime to afford it, telling myself that this was proof I belonged in this family, only to be told in front of everyone that I was replaceable and no longer wanted. I remember smiling, a tight reflex I couldn't stop, and saying I understood, because arguing would have only given them something else to dismiss, and because in that moment I realized the decision had already been made long before the candles were blown out, that this wasn't about a birthday or a fight or teenage emotions, but about how they truly saw me as a stand-in who had overstayed his usefulness. And while Emma went back to her friends, and Melissa began discussing plans with the man who had been mostly absent for years, I quietly took mental inventory of everything I had given and everything I still controlled, every bill in my name, every sacrifice I'd made without being asked, and I understood that walking away loudly would only feed their narrative. So I chose silence instead, not because I was weak, but because I was done begging for a place I had already earned. And as I cleaned up that night, alone in a house that suddenly felt, I didn't grieve out loud or make threats or plead for reconsideration. I simply started planning, carefully and patiently, knowing that disappearing the right way required far more strength than staying where I was no longer wanted. I met Melissa in 2011 at a business networking event in Chicago, one of those rooms filled with confident smiles, name tags, and people pretending they weren't sizing each other up, and she stood out immediately, polished and charming, talking effortlessly about her work as a pharmaceutical rep, while casually mentioning she was recently divorced and raising a 5-year-old daughter on her own. And there was something about the way she framed it that made me want to step closer rather than back, like she was strong but tired, capable but waiting for someone reliable to finally show up. At the time, I was doing well as a commercial contractor, financially stable, no kids, no previous marriages, and I had convinced myself that meant I was ready for something meaningful, something that mattered beyond work and numbers. So when Melissa talked about how hard it was doing everything alone and how she just wanted a stable life for Emma, I slid into the role she didn't explicitly ask for, but clearly welcomed. The dependable guy who could fix things, pay for things, and make uncertainty disappear. Things move fast, faster than I should have questioned, because Emma warmed up to me almost immediately, holding my hand when we walked together, asking me to read bedtime stories, introducing me to her teachers as her dad months before Melissa and I were even engaged. And instead of seeing that as something that deserved caution, I took it as proof that this was meant to be, that I wasn't just dating a woman, but becoming part of a ready-made family that needed me. We were married within a year, and by the time Emma turned 7, I legally adopted her, signing papers with a full heart and the unshakable belief that love plus commitment automatically created permanence, that biology and past mistakes no longer mattered once I was officially there. For years, I told myself I was building something real, something solid, a family anchored by consistency and sacrifice. But looking back, I can see how quietly transactional it all was, how my role was never questioned as long as I was providing stability, funding the lifestyle, smoothing over gaps left by her biological father, and never asking too much emotional space for myself. I wasn't a partner shaping a shared future. I was a silent investor in a fantasy that looked perfect on the outside, and I didn't realize it until much later, when the illusion cracked, and I understood that what I thought was unconditional belonging had always depended on how useful I was to the story they wanted to tell. After we got married, I sold my condo and bought a large house in a quiet, desirable Illinois suburb, the kind of place people brag about at barbecues, tree-lined streets, good schools, and a big backyard. And I told myself this was what progress looked like, that this was me stepping fully into the role I had chosen. And not long after we moved, Melissa quit her job, explaining that she wanted to focus on Emma and be present in ways she hadn't been able before. And I agreed without hesitation because it sounded noble and because I could afford it, or at least I believed I could. From that point on, I paid for everything. Not just the obvious things like the mortgage and utilities, but ballet classes that turned into private lessons, orthodontic work that cost more than my first car, family vacations that somehow always got more expensive each year, school trips, clothes, extracurriculars, and eventually a private tutor when Melissa decided the public school curriculum wasn't challenging enough. And every time I signed a check or approved a transfer, I told myself this was what being a good husband and father meant. I started a college fund the moment we got married, quietly setting money aside every month, even during slower work periods. And I watched that account grow over the years until by the time Emma turned 18, it had crossed $200,000, a number that made me proud in a way I never said out loud, because to me it represented security, opportunity, proof that I was doing my job right. Meanwhile, Melissa filled the house with constant change, redecorating every couple years because she got bored with the look, booking spa packages as self-care, upgrading phones, handbags, furniture, and weekend getaways, and racking up luxury charges with casual ease that made it all feel abstract, like numbers in a game that would reset on their own. And when I noticed or hesitated, she'd laugh it off and remind me that we were comfortable, that we deserved to enjoy life. At the time, I told myself I didn't mind, that money was replaceable and family wasn't, that my role was to provide stability so they could thrive, and I genuinely believed I was investing in something permanent, something reciprocal, not realizing that I was the only one treated like a long-term commitment rather than a resource that would always be there until it wasn't. When Emma turned 16, something shifted almost overnight. Subtle at first, then sharp, like a draft creeping in through a window you thought was sealed. One day, she was still calling me Dad, with that familiar affection, and the next it was Dan, cold and clinical, like I was a teacher or a neighbor, someone peripheral she had to tolerate. I tried not to take it personally, chalked it up to teenage mood swings, the usual growing pains everyone warned you about, but it didn't stop there. She began pulling away in ways I couldn't ignore, skipping our Sunday morning pancake ritual without explanation, brushing off the father-daughter movie nights we'd done for years, refusing to come along on errands or sit beside me at family dinners. And then came the reappearance of Mike, her biological father, who after more than a decade of absence resurfaced with a shiny new job in tech and an apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a rooftop pool. At first, it was just the occasional visit, something Melissa said was healthy and important for closure, but soon weekend became his territory, and with them came a wave of comparisons I hadn't prepared for. Mike didn't have rules, didn't ask where she was going or when she'd be home, and that made him cool. Why, the man who'd raised her, paid for her education, wiped her tears, and sat through dance recitals, was suddenly controlling for asking if she'd done her homework or checking if she'd be back for dinner. She stopped acknowledging me in public, avoided my side of the room at gatherings, and started talking to me with the clipped tone of someone tolerating a stranger. The house began to feel smaller, not because of space, but because of the walls she was building around herself. And no matter how many times I tried to talk to her, to ask what had changed, the answer was always silence or sarcasm. I finally brought it up to Melissa late one night, sitting in the kitchen while she scrolled on her phone, and I told her I felt like I was disappearing in my own home, like I was being quietly erased. She didn't even look up when she said, "You're being too sensitive. Let her bond with her father." And that sentence hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was the implication that I had no place in that bond, no history worth preserving, as if Mike's sudden return rewrote everything that came before. That moment was when I realized something I had wanted to admit. The foundation I thought we had built together had cracks I couldn't repair on my own, and the house I had poured my life into no longer felt like mine. It was the beginning of the end, even if I didn't know it yet. Emma's 18th birthday party was a night everything finally dropped the mask, and it happened in front of everyone I had invited, everyone I had paid to feed, entertain, and impress, and an event that cost me $12,000 because I wanted it to be special, memorable, a milestone she would associate with love and stability. Music was playing, people were laughing, and I was standing near the edge of the room when Mike suddenly asked for everyone's attention, pulling car keys from his pocket like he was about to perform a magic trick, and when he handed them to Emma and announced it was a brand new red Toyota Corolla, the room exploded. Emma screamed so loudly people outside probably heard it. She ran at him, jumped into his arms, and wrapped her legs around his waist like she was 5 years old again, shouting that he was the best dad ever, over and over, while people clapped and filmed and looked at me with quick, awkward glances before turning back to the spectacle. I stood there holding my own gift, a $2,000 MacBook and a check specifically marked for her textbooks, something practical, something meant to support her future, and when she opened it later, it barely earned a distracted thank you before she was pulled back into Mike's orbit, basking in the attention, the symbolism, the moment. I told myself not to be petty, not to compare, not to let it hurt, but it did, because the difference wasn't the price tag. It was a performance, the public declaration of who mattered now and who didn't. By the time the party wound down and the guests started leaving, I already felt like a stranger in my own house, like the walls were watching me pack myself away quietly. Later that night, after the last plate was cleared, Melissa asked me to sit down, and Emma and Mike joined us, standing together across from me like a united front, calm and composed in a way that felt rehearsed. They told me Emma wanted Mike to take over as her father now that she was an adult, that it made more sense, that it would be healthier for everyone. And then Melissa suggested gently that I move out so Mike could move in, framing it like a logistical adjustment rather than an emotional execution. No raised voices, no anger, just polite smiles and that awful tone people use when they think they're being generous. Then Emma looked me straight in the eye and said that the best gift I could give her was to disappear from her life forever, and Melissa nodded in agreement, like this was reasonable, settled, and long overdue. And in that moment, I understood that the party wasn't a celebration at all. It was my send-off, and I was the only one who hadn't known it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a dramatic scene. I went to bed that night in silence, packed a small overnight bag before sunrise, and walked out of the house like a man heading to a meeting, not exile. But before I left, I made one very important call to my lawyer. The house, that beautiful two-story with a manicured lawn and newly renovated kitchen, was mine and mine alone, purchased years before I ever met Melissa. I had always kept the title in my name, a quiet precaution that now felt prophetic. Melissa had no legal claim to it. She may have decorated it, but she didn't own a single square inch. The college fund, the one I'd spent years building, feeding with bonuses and tax returns and spare income while everyone else spent without thinking, was under my custodianship. I was the account holder, and she had no access. I closed it the next morning with a few digital signatures, moved the funds into my private retirement portfolio, and rewrote every beneficiary on every policy and investment I owned. No more Melissa in case of emergency. No more Emma on anything. I erased them like they had erased me. Then I listed the house. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't send a heads-up text. I contacted the real estate agent we'd used years before, handed her the keys, and signed the papers. The market was hot. It went under contract in 72 hours. The for sale sign went up in the front yard before the weekend, right next to the flowers I planted last spring. Melissa found out when she pulled into the driveway after one of her spa appointments and saw it planted in the grass like a verdict. She came storming into my temporary office the same afternoon, eyes wide with disbelief, lips trembling with fury, and screamed, "You can't do this." Her voice cracked, whether from shock or ego. I didn't care. I looked up from my desk without flinching and said, "Oh, I can. You asked me to disappear. I'm just making sure I don't leave the house behind." She stood there stunned, not expecting calm, not expecting control. But I'd had enough. This was my goodbye. Not a tantrum, not a plea, just a quiet collapse of the fantasy she thought would hold forever. Emma found out the house was sold not from me, not from Melissa, but from a friend who sent her the Zillow link with the listing photos and the bold red, pending banner at the top. I wasn't home when she stormed in, but the minute I walked to the front door, she was already screaming, red-faced and frantic, shouting that I was ruining her life, that I was being cruel and vindictive, that I was tearing everything apart for no reason. She paced the living room like she still owned it, like she had any claim to the walls she once refused to acknowledge me within. Melissa trailed behind her, trying to play mediator, but slipping between pleading and entitlement with every breath. She begged me to stop the sale, to transfer the deed to Emma, to give her the house as a graduation gift. It's what any loving father would do, she said, her voice cracking not from sorrow, but panic. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told her no. One word. No explanation. No compromise. Just no. The call started soon after. Melissa's parents, furious and self-righteous, shaming me for abandoning my family, lecturing me about duty and responsibility as if the last 13 years had meant nothing, as if I hadn't already poured every ounce of myself into a life that they were more than happy to enjoy as long as I stayed in the background. I let them talk until they ran out of steam, and then calmly told them they should direct their concerns to Mike. After all, he was the real dad now, wasn't he? Let him handle the mortgage, the tuition, the insurance, the everything. Silence followed. The kind of silence you only hear when people suddenly realize they no longer have leverage. The final blow came a week later when Emma received a legal notice informing her that the college fund, the same one she'd been counting on for years, was no longer active. She showed up with Mike in tow, both of them standing in my driveway like they had something righteous to deliver. Emma shoved a notice at me and accused me of betrayal, of pettiness, of ruining her future. Mike, who had contributed nothing to that fund, puffed his chest like he had any authority to be angry and demanded I make things right. I didn't flinch. I didn't backpedal. I reminded her, plainly, without venom, that she had made her choice. She asked me to disappear. Melissa supported it. Mike was supposed to take over, and I had simply honored their wishes. I looked her in the eye and said, "You wanted me gone. Now I'm gone, and so is everything I brought with me." There was nothing left to argue, just the echo of what they chose, ringing louder than any apology they were too proud to give. 3 weeks after the papers were signed, the house officially closed. I walked away with $610,000 in my account and, more importantly, a clean conscience. No guilt, no second-guessing, just a quiet relief of finally being free from a life where I had become invisible the moment my money was no longer convenient. I moved into a modern apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows, polished concrete floors, and not a single memory tied to anyone but myself. For the first time in over a decade, I woke up in a space that didn't feel like a stage set for someone else's performance. I went to bed without waiting for silence after slammed doors. I ate what I wanted when I wanted, and I didn't have to ask permission to hang a photo or choose a rug. I started dating again, slowly, carefully, without rushing into anything that smelled like rescue or obligation. I remembered what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than provider. I booked a solo trip to Italy, something I'd always wanted to do but never did because there was always a ballet recital or a last-minute expense or someone else's schedule that mattered more than mine. I wandered through Florence, drank espresso in Rome, and sat on a balcony in Positano, watching the sun drop into the ocean with no one asking me to fix or fund anything. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again, not Dan the stepdad, Dan the ATM, Dan the guy who always showed up even when no one asked him to, but just Dan. 6 months after the house sold, I stopped at a coffee shop on my way to a meeting. It was one of those newer places with exposed brick and handwritten menus, and I didn't even look up when I placed my order. But when I stepped aside to wait for my drink, I heard my name, soft and unsure. I turned, and there she was, Emma, in a green apron behind the counter, holding a paper cup with my name scribbled on the side. Her face dropped the second our eyes met. The confidence, the entitlement, the smug indifference that had once defined her tone was gone. She looked small, tired, like someone who had just begun to understand the weight of her own choices. "I'm sorry," she whispered, almost inaudible, and for a brief second, I felt the ghost of the girl who used to call me Daddy, who used to sit on my shoulders at 4th of July parades, who used to run to the door when I got home from work. But the man who had stood alone at her party, who had packed his bags while she celebrated with another man in the house he built, who had watched his name be discarded like a receipt. That man had nothing left to give. I took the coffee from her hands, met her eyes, and said, "Sorry doesn't pay for college, does it?" Then I turned and walked out, not bitter, not angry, just done. I had given 13 years of my life, my love, and my money. And when it became clear that to them I was just a paycheck, I did the one thing none of them ever expected. I stopped paying.